I don't think there's any kind of betrayal more personal than what my parents did to me. It's not the kind of thing you just brush off either. You don't forget being cut out of the biggest decision of your life, especially when it's about something that's meant to be your future. It all started when my parents decided to give my childhood home to my sister. They didn't even bother telling me. They just did it, like it was a simple formality. I'm not sure why I wasn't told. I'm the oldest. I've always been the responsible one. And don't get me wrong, I love my sister. But she's always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. And suddenly, this huge decision about our family home, the one place that had held so many memories, was handed over to her without a word to me. At first, I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe they were just figuring things out. But as days passed, I realized I had been completely left out of the conversation. No one even asked me if I wanted the house. No one even brought it up as an option for me. It felt like my parents had made up their minds long before I even knew what was going on. What really stung was that they didn't even give me the courtesy of a heads up. No, hey, we're planning to give the house to your sister, or we've been talking about it and we want to make sure you're okay with the decision. No, nothing like that. Just a silent, unspoken decision that left me feeling completely blindsided. I'll admit, at first I thought maybe I was overreacting. I mean, maybe they had their reasons, right? But as time went on, I started putting the pieces together. And that's when I realized just how deep the betrayal ran. Then came the day I found out just how much they'd kept from me. I was at my parents' house, visiting, and I overheard a conversation between my mom and dad in the kitchen. It wasn't supposed to be anything important, I'm sure of it. But then I heard it. The words that shattered everything. They had signed the deed over to my sister. Without telling me. Without asking me. Without even considering me in the slightest. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about a house. This was about my entire relationship with my parents. Everything I thought we had. This was their way of saying, we've chosen her. And just like that, I was pushed aside. It wasn't the house that hurt. It was the realization that my parents didn't think I deserved to be part of their future decisions. I stood there in shock for a long time, unsure of what to do with this new information. I didn't want to act impulsively, but I also knew that I couldn't let this slide. Not this time. So, I made a decision in that moment. A decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to just sit back and let them get away with this. If they thought they had me cornered, they were wrong. I was going to take back control, one way or another. Looking back, this wasn't the first time I felt overlooked. It wasn't the first time I felt like my parents had a way of showing favoritism toward my sister. We'd always been different, but that gap between us grew wider as we got older. Growing up, I was the one who always took responsibility. I was the one who did well in school, who kept my head down and followed the rules. My sister, on the other hand, was always the wild card. She was the creative one, the free spirit. Sure, she was bright in her own way, but she had a knack for skirting responsibility. While I was at home, helping out around the house, my sister was out with friends or involved in some new project that caught her attention. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, it seemed like my parents never saw me the way they saw her. My achievements were often overlooked or taken for granted, while anything she did was celebrated like it was the greatest thing in the world. I never really understood it. Sure, she was charismatic and charming in her own way, but there was no way I could ever shake the feeling that I was the invisible one in the family. For years, I had accepted that. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need constant praise to feel good about myself. But as I grew older and became more independent, the cracks started to show. Whenever my sister was in trouble, it was always me who was expected to help. I was the one who would drop everything to help with whatever she needed, be it a loan, emotional support, or just advice. And while I never asked for anything in return, I started to feel like my generosity was being taken for granted. My sister knew she could count on me, but my parents did too. I started to realize that they saw me as the dependable one, the one who wouldn't rock the boat. It wasn't just my parents. Friends, extended family, they all seemed to gravitate toward her. Her charm, her ability to talk herself out of anything, always worked in her favor. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved. I didn't make a scene. And as much as I resented it, I tried to be the person everyone depended on. I tried to be the good daughter, the one who never made waves. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that everyone was taking me for granted. It wasn't fair. And yet I kept pushing those feelings aside, thinking maybe one day things would change. The house, though, that was the tipping point. I'd always assumed that when my parents passed on, the house would be passed to me. It made sense, right? I was the one who had helped with upkeep. I was the one who had stayed home over the holidays and spent time with them when they were sick or needed help with something. But in the back of my mind, there was always that little voice that wondered, what if they don't give me the house? I should have trusted my instincts. I should have seen the signs. But I ignored it, telling myself that they wouldn't do that they wouldn't play favorites with something as important as the family home. But when the truth came out, it all made sense. They didn't give me the house because they didn't think I needed it. They didn't trust me to handle it. And worst of all, they thought I'd be fine with it. After all, they were giving the house to my sister, the one they believed had more spirit, the one they believed would carry on the family legacy. I was furious, but I wasn't going to show it. Not yet. I couldn't let them see how much they had hurt me. No, I was going to handle this my way. I wasn't about to let them get away with making this decision behind my back. But I needed time. I needed to gather my thoughts and figure out how to approach this. The last thing I wanted was to act out of anger. I wanted to do this right, to make sure I had all the information I needed before I made my move. I spent the next few weeks gathering my thoughts and putting my plan into action. It wasn't easy, though. The emotional weight of what my parents had done still lingered, and I had to keep my cool around them, pretending that everything was fine. I didn't want them to catch on to the fact that I was plotting something in the background. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, some detail that would make the entire thing make sense. So, I began to investigate. Slowly. Carefully. The first thing I did was start looking into the legal side of things. I knew that once my parents passed, they had planned to divide up their estate. I didn't want to rely solely on what my sister had told me. I needed the cold, hard truth. So I contacted a lawyer. I didn't explain why I needed the information, just asked a few general questions about property transfers, and if it was possible for one sibling to be excluded from a family inheritance without their knowledge. The lawyer didn't seem to think it was anything out of the ordinary, but it wasn't the answer I was looking for. I needed more. Then, one evening, I overheard a conversation between my sister and my mom when I was at their house. I'd come over for dinner, and they didn't know I was listening in. It was supposed to be casual, a regular conversation, but they were talking about the house, again. Only this time, it wasn't just about my sister getting the house, it was about the plans for selling it. You know, after the paperwork is finalized, my sister said, I'll need to get it listed quickly. We've got to move on this. Of course, my mom responded. But don't forget what we agreed on, okay? You take care of everything, and I'll help you with whatever you need. We've got to make sure the house is sold for a good price. That was the moment it all clicked. They weren't just giving her the house. They were expecting her to sell it. There was no mention of me in any of this. No, let's talk to your brother. Or, we'll let you know what we plan to do with your share. Nothing. Just a deal between the two of them to sell it off and move on with their lives. I stood frozen for a moment, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. My sister wasn't just inheriting the house. She was going to profit off of it. And the worst part? I had been completely excluded from the entire plan. I didn't confront them that night. I wasn't ready yet. But I went home and I started to dig deeper. I began looking through old documents, things my parents had kept from their younger days. It wasn't hard to find the deed to the house, hidden in a drawer in their office of all places. I was careful not to leave any trace of what I was doing, but as I looked at the deed, I realized something. The paperwork had already been signed. My sister was now the sole owner. I wasn't stupid. I knew that if I didn't act fast, I'd be stuck watching my childhood home slip away, with nothing to show for it. That's when I started setting my plan in motion. The first step was to make sure that my sister didn't know I was on to her. I began acting like everything was normal, staying cordial but distant. She had no idea that I was already steps ahead. I started paying attention to the little things, how much my sister was planning to sell the house for, how much she had already started working on it, and who was involved. I began gathering evidence that I could use to my advantage. Next, I started contacting people in the family who might have information that could help me. A few well-placed calls, a couple of conversations with people who were close to my parents, and I started to see cracks in my sister's story. There were whispers about her being less than transparent with my parents, about how she might have manipulated them into thinking that she was the better choice. But here's the thing. My sister was a master of making people think she was innocent. She could charm her way out of anything, and I knew she thought she had won this battle. She thought I'd just fade into the background and accept her getting the house. But she was wrong. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I wasn't going to let her sell the house, walk away with a ton of money, and leave me with nothing. No, I was going to make sure that she understood the consequences of betraying me like this. And I had a plan that was going to hit her hard, emotionally and financially. She had no idea what was coming. The day I decided to execute my plan, everything had to go perfectly. There could be no mistakes, no room for error. My sister still had no idea that I knew everything. She was too caught up in her idea of control, in the sense that she had everything lined up the way she wanted it. She thought she had me beat, that I would just stand by while she made all the decisions about the house. But what she didn't know was that I had already taken steps to ensure that her victory would be short-lived. I had spent the last few weeks quietly gathering everything I needed: evidence, documentation, and a detailed timeline of how everything had gone down. I had spoken to a lawyer, someone I trusted, and made sure that I knew exactly how to legally contest the decision about the house. And then I gathered up all the proof that my sister had been manipulating the situation, intentionally keeping me in the dark, lying to my parents to make them believe I wouldn't care about the house. The first step in my plan was to ensure that my sister couldn't sell the house without serious consequences. I had my lawyer send a formal letter to her. Nothing too aggressive, just a letter saying that there were some irregularities in the ownership of the property that would require further investigation. It was a simple tactic, but it was enough to make her sweat. If she tried to sell the house too quickly, this would delay everything and complicate the process. I knew it would rattle her. The whole point was to make her second-guess her entire plan. The longer she had to wait, the more pressure she'd be under, and that was when I'd strike. I didn't have to wait long. The next day, she called me, furious. I could hear her trying to control her anger, but she was seething. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped when I picked up the phone. I didn't say a word at first, just let her rant. It felt good to finally have the upper hand. After what felt like an eternity, I spoke. "Calm down," I said, my voice steady. "I'm just looking out for myself here. It's funny. You seem so confident that everything is going to go your way. But the truth is, you never thought I'd fight back, did you?" There was silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her brain working, trying to figure out what I was talking about. She knew I had always been the passive one, the one who never caused drama, and here I was, forcing her into a corner. "Look," she said finally, after a long pause. "You don't need to make this a big deal. It's just the house. Let's move on." I couldn't help but laugh. Move on? No, this isn't just about the house. This is about respect. This is about you thinking you could just sweep me aside without consequences. I hung up, knowing that she was already scrambling, but that was just the beginning. A week later, I had everything I needed. The legal documents, the proof that my sister had pressured my parents into giving her the house without consulting me, the phone records showing how she'd carefully avoided my calls about the estate. I had it all, and I knew what to do next. I called a family meeting, one that my parents weren't expecting. I didn't give my sister any warning, didn't let her prepare. I had everything in place, and I was going to take back what was rightfully mine. When we sat down in the living room, my sister looked at me, all smug confidence. She was still holding on to the illusion that she had won, but she didn't know I was about to take everything from her. "I think it's time we talked about this house," I said calmly, looking at both of my parents. My sister's expression immediately shifted. She knew I wasn't there to chat casually anymore. She looked at my parents, then back at me, but said nothing. I turned to my parents. "I've been doing some digging," I began, pulling out the paperwork and laying it on the table in front of them. "It turns out there's a lot about this whole house transfer that wasn't exactly above board." The shock on their faces was enough to make me feel a little better about everything that had happened. I knew I had their attention. I wasn't going to let them off the hook so easily. "You can't just give away the house without telling me," I continued, my voice growing firmer. "And certainly not behind my back. I've spent my entire life helping out, doing what I thought was expected of me. But all this time, you've been making decisions for me without even consulting me." My sister's face went pale as she realized what I was doing. She opened her mouth to speak, but I silenced her with one sharp look. "And you," I said, turning to her. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you manipulated Mom and Dad into thinking I didn't care about the house. You made sure I was left out of the conversation." The silence in the room was deafening. My sister had no answer. She couldn't argue with the facts. In that moment, I knew I had won. My sister's entire plan was crumbling before her eyes, and she had no one to blame but herself. The fallout from that family meeting was nothing short of explosive. After everything I revealed, my sister was beyond furious. She tried to argue, but nothing she said could undo what had been laid bare. The truth was too obvious, too damning. My parents, stunned into silence for the first time in a long while, couldn't deny what had happened. They realized they had made a huge mistake. But it was too late to fix things now, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The aftermath of that meeting was a blur. My sister, who had always been so confident, now found herself in a position she hadn't prepared for. She couldn't exactly sell the house with the legal cloud hanging over it. Every time she tried to make a move, I made sure there was an obstacle. I called the lawyer again, and we ensured that everything was legally tied up. I wasn't about to let her walk away without facing some serious consequences. In the weeks that followed, I made sure my parents knew just how much they had hurt me. I didn't go out of my way to be cruel, but I wasn't afraid to point out how poorly they had treated me. I reminded them that I had always been there for them, while my sister had only shown up when it was convenient for her. I made sure they understood that I wasn't going to quietly accept being pushed aside anymore. The dynamic had shifted, and they could either accept that or lose me entirely. My sister, on the other hand, tried to salvage the situation. She showed up at my door one day, desperate to talk. She claimed she was sorry, that she never meant for things to go this far. But I wasn't buying it. She knew exactly what she was doing when she manipulated the situation, and her apology felt hollow. Still, I listened. It wasn't for her. It was for me. So I could close the door on this chapter once and for all. "I never meant for this to turn into something so ugly," she said, her voice shaky. "I thought we could share the house, that we could work something out." I looked at her, calm but firm. "No, you didn't. You thought you could take it all, and you were willing to do anything to make sure I wouldn't stand in your way. But you didn't count on me actually standing up for myself." She didn't have a response. She just stood there, defeated. It was clear that everything she had fought for had slipped through her fingers. The house, the money, the control. It was all slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As for my parents, they began to realize the full scope of what they had done. They couldn't change the past, but I could see the regret in their eyes. It wasn't enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. I made sure to hold them accountable, but I also made it clear that I wasn't going to let this destroy our family. Moving forward, things would be different. I would be different. and they would have to learn to respect that. Months later, I was still in control of the situation. My sister never did manage to sell the house. After a long legal battle, she ended up having to give up her claim to the property entirely. She was left with nothing but a heap of debt from the legal fees and a tarnished reputation in the family. My parents tried to make amends, but the trust was gone. I wasn't willing to forgive them easily, and honestly, I didn't need their approval anymore. I had taken back what was rightfully mine. Not just the house, but my power, my respect, and my self-worth. And as for my sister, she never saw it coming. She never thought I would be the one to expose everything, to take control of my life. But in the end, that's exactly what happened. I didn't need to be the quiet one anymore. I didn't need to play the part of the good child who always did what they were told. No. I was in control now, and the feeling was better than any inheritance could ever be. I walked away from that whole mess with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. The house was mine, not because they gave it to me, but because I took it back. I didn't need them to define me anymore, and I sure as hell didn't need them to tell me what I deserved. It was over. I had won.